Welcome to the Neuroscience Cafe, and this event is brought to you by the UAB Comprehensive Neuroscience Center, or the CNC. Slide. Karen? Next slide. Yeah, so the CNC is really a center that brings together all the neuroscientists at UAB. Neuroscientists are located in different schools, in different departments. So it's really important to have a place where people can interact and meet and share ideas and projects. So we have about 500 faculty, clinicians, staff, students, and trainees that are part of a network, and that they are comprised of professionals from 32 departments and 9 schools. So the CNC Neuroscience Cafe is a monthly community commitment designed to bring neuroscientists and clinicians to you to discuss current research and knowledge in various topics of neuroscience. So please share what you have learned tonight. So next slide. So I'm Adrienne Latti, I'm the director of the CNC. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurobiology at UAB. The co-director is Lucas Pozzo-Miller, who is a professor in the Department of Neurobiology in the School of Medicine, and Lauren Sinsich, who is our associate director and is an associate professor in the Department of Optometry and Vision Science. Next slide. So we are really very lucky today to have 2 wonderful speakers who are going to speak about sleep and circadian rhythms during a pandemic. So the first person is Karen Gamble. Karen Gamble is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurobiology. She's also the vice chair of basic research in that department. So she obtained her PhD from Georgia State University, and then she did a postdoc at Vanderbilt, and then she came to us at UAB in 2009. Her interest is really how the environment modulates circadian clock function and how the contribution of circadian clock to disease. You will understand better what she is doing when she will be speaking. She is also very involved in training the future generation of neuroscientists, because she's the director of the neuroscience team of the graduate biomedical science program at UAB. This is for all the people getting a bachelor degree. Justin Thomas is our second speaker. He's an assistant professor also in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurobiology. He's also the director of the UAB Behavioral Sleep Medicine Clinic. So Dr. Thomas received his PhD from the University of Alabama, and he completed his internship at the University of Florida, and then came back to Alabama, but to UAB, to pursue a postdoctoral research fellowship on sleep and hypertension. So his research is looking at health psychology and also sleep medicine. He explores how circadian and sleep mechanisms underlie health and health disparities. So my last slide is just, we'll let you know, can you move to the next thing? So speaking about our upcoming cafe, on April 15, we have a really special event between Jean Mahazo and David Kimberland, who are going to give us a COVID update where and are we with testing, treatment, and vaccination. And what you have to realize is that Dr. Marazzo, he's the division director for infectious disease at UAB, but she's a well-known person, and she had been on CNN, she had been on several social platforms speaking about COVID. So she is really one of our most outstanding infectious disease person, not only at UAB, but in the country. In May, we will have Dr. David Knight and Dr. Amy Knight, who are going to speak about anxiety and stress disorder following traumatic medical events. So, as you see, we have other Neuroscience Cafe that we are planning for May on diet and brain, exercise and neuro disorder, guts and brains, football concussion research. And in the future, we'll bring other teams. So without further ado, I would like to ask Karen to go ahead and speak about her research. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks. Oh, this was one more slide, sorry. One more slide, and I'm happy to say this. So I'm going to get Justin, Thomas, and I started off.
You can pass that one. Okay.
There we go. Okay. To get us started off this evening. So we're really happy to talk about sleep and circadian rhythms. It's obviously a favorite topic of Justin and I. So I'm going to start us off. And one thing that I will mention, I'm sure you will have lots of questions. Everyone loves to talk about sleep. And if you will hold those to the end, we're going to save plenty of time for questions. So the goals for today are to cover, like, what does normal sleep and circadian rhythm look like? And then how does disruption of sleep or circadian rhythms, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what that means, how does that affect your health? And then lastly, we're going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 and specifically about how to sleep during a pandemic. You've probably noticed yourself that your sleep is probably quite a bit different than it was a year and a half ago. So first point that I would like to make is that sleep is an active state. So your brain does not just completely shut off when you go to sleep. You may feel like it has shut off, but it's actually, there's a whole lot going on in your head when you're asleep, besides just dreaming. And this is something that we find in pretty much every animal, every mammal, even invertebrates. Actually, they've now shown that worms even have a sleep state. So this is something that's obviously very important to life and living. And so there's a lot of discussion about why we sleep and what sort of function sleep may actually serve. And some of those ideas are memory consolidation. There's a number of hormones that are particularly released while you're sleeping that are pretty low when you're awake. And then another important function of sleep is repair. So a lot of the damage that may happen during the day, during waking and during moving around, those get repaired in the evening when you're sleeping. And then a more recent topic that has come up in the research area is this idea that your brain, specifically this system called the glymphatic system, where your cerebral spinal fluid is important for clearing out neurotoxins from your brain that accumulate during wakefulness. And so there's a lot of ideas about what sleep is doing. So there are several different stages of sleep, and you may have heard about some of those. I'm actually going to start with this last one, which is rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep for short. And this is when you actually, most of the time when you're dreaming is happening during this stage. And then the other parts of your sleep are referred to as non-REM sleep. And there are 3 stages of non-REM sleep, N1, N2, and N3, that are classified according to your brain waves that are being processed during these different stages, with the idea that N3 is the deepest sleep, where you actually have what's called delta waves. And it's really important that you get all of these different types of sleep as you progress throughout the night. And so this is what we call a hypnograph, which I think is kind of a funny term. And you can see how these sleep stages progress throughout the night. And I'm going to use my pointer here. Hopefully you can see this. So down here, you have how many hours of sleep. So we're looking at 7 hours of sleep. And then on this axis, you have the sleep stage. And so if you look at these little red blips, these are the time that you're spending in REM sleep. And then these are stages 1, 2, and 3. This is actually according to the old classification where there used to be 4 stages of sleep. But basically, this is your deepest stage of sleep. And so what you can see is that people progress through these cycles about 4 to 5 times a night in about 90-minute cycles. And the other thing that you'll notice is that in the first half of the night, you spend more of your time in this deepest sleep, the deeper stage sleeps. And then the second half of the night, you're spending more time in your REM sleep. And that's normal, that's healthy. And you can see that there's some changes as we age. So children and young adult look like this, but then as we age, you can see that these sleep stages the organization of them start to fall apart. And there are many different parts of your brain we're not going to go into tonight due to the sake of time that control the progression of these sleep stages as you go throughout the night. But overall, this 24-hour sleep-wake cycle is governed by 2 very distinct processes. One is the circadian process. And so when I use the word circadian, that's actually comes from a Latin term where circa means about and dia means about a day. So basically this refers to any process that cycles on a 24-hour cycle, like your sleep-wake cycle. And so there's a circadian process that sort of governs the allowable time of sleep. And then there's also a homeostatic process that controls the intensity of your sleep or your sleep debt. And this will make more sense in this next graph that I'll show you. This is really the best way to sort of get an idea of how this works. So here down at the bottom, we have the time of day going from morning to evening. And then this is the overnight hours when you're sleeping. And so this homeostatic process that we call sleep load or sleep drive is something that builds up the longer you're awake. Okay, so this is sort of your sleep debt, as if you will. And so the longer you're awake, the greater and greater your sleep drive is building up. And then when you finally do get an opportunity to sleep, it slowly resets itself until you wake up. So this is the homeostatic drive of sleep. At the same time, you have this circadian process that's going on, this circadian alerting signal, and it starts out kind of low in the morning, but it builds up throughout the day and it sort of peaks in this evening hour. So you may have experienced this afternoon slump here when you may feel like you want to take a nap. It's just after lunch. This is really the relationship of these 2 processes coming together where your sleep load has already started to build up, but your circadian alerting system hasn't really hit its maximum. And the other thing that I'll mention is that obviously when these things peak can vary by individual. So you may have noticed that throughout your life, you've been more of a morning person or more of an evening person. And those things are really thought to be strongly genetically determined. And it's really hard to change that about you. So when I'm showing the circadian alerting system peaking here at 9 p.m., that may be different for each individual. And so this circadian process results in different functions happening at different times of the day. So you may notice that in the afternoon, you have your best coordination and reaction time, especially if you're an athlete or a runner. Your highest blood pressure and body temperature are in the early evening hours. Your testosterone and hormones are happening. And then the other things that are happening in your body with the body temperature, you also have your night hormone that's arising, like melatonin. And so the melatonin, and let me get my pointer back so I can switch the slide. Melatonin is actually has a circadian rhythm that is driven by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, which is produced only at night. It's pretty low during the day. And this will happen even if you are living in a cave for several months at a time. You'll still have this 24-hour rhythm of this night hormone. However, light will suppress the production of this hormone. And so it's really important then in the evening when you're watching TV or reading your iPad or looking at a computer you're actually suppressing the natural rise of this night hormone. And so you really want to be careful about light exposure at the wrong time of day. But you also at the same time want to have good light exposure coming into your brain at the right time of day, like during the day when you should be awake. And so this process happens when light enters your eye and activates a particular type of neuron in your retina called ganglion cells. And these ganglion cells connect with neurons that are in, again, this suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this is a very small nucleus that has about 10,000 neurons that are tightly coupled, and they're very electrically active. And so these neurons are the key circadian pacemaker for your entire body. And so I've shown it here. This obviously is not a human brain. This is a rodent brain. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. And this is the schematic that I just showed you with the SCN here. But what you'll find is that the SCN or suprachiasmatic nucleus is not the only clock in your brain. There's also other clocks throughout your brain. There's also clocks in your body, including, I've just shown some sample organs here, the kidney and the liver shown here. And so we tend to think of the circadian system as an orchestra in which you have a conductor that is like this SCN is the conductor, but you have all these different instruments and they all have important different roles to play. Another analogy I like to make is that the SCN is sort of the one ring to rule them all. And then you have multiple rings. So that's sort of a fun reference. So basically you have all these clocks throughout your body and they all have to be synchronized with one another. And they all have to be synchronized with the environment. And so when you lose the synchrony in your body, that's when you have a problem with disease. So you may end up with insulin problems or inflammatory problems, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later, or cardiometabolic problems. And so each of these individual tissues have cells, and these cells all have individual clocks. So if you think about the clock, if you were to take it off the wall and turn it around and look at the back of it, you would notice that there's gears in the back of that clock. That's a mechanism that caused the hands of the clock to cycle around, right, its face. And so these gears are actually a cellular mechanism that's a feedback loop. And this was discovered a couple decades ago, actually, in Drosophila, which are fruit flies. And so the 2017 Nobel Prize was awarded to the researchers, Jeffrey Hall, Mike Rosbash, and Michael Young, for the discovery of this mechanism in flies. And it turns out that the same mechanism happens even in people and in mammals. And so this is an example of this feedback loop. And I'm not going to go through all of these individual players, but these are the names of the key, very, very well conserved circadian genes that are found in nearly all mammalian cells, including in people, even in your blood cells. So this is actually some data that's from my lab where we isolated peripheral blood mononuclear cells. So this layer here, you collect blood and isolate it into its different components, and then you isolate the mRNA from these PBMCs. And what you can see is that these key core clock genes, here we have PER1, PER2, PER3, and BMAL1, they change over the light cycle. So this is 9 a.m., this is 6 p.m., and then this is back to 6 a.m. So even in your blood, your cells have this key mechanism or the gears of the circadian clock. And so it turns out that this core cycling mechanism is really important for regulating the timing of a whole host of genes. And it turns out that almost half of all the protein encoding genes in mammals actually show 24-hour rhythms, or these circadian rhythms, somewhere in the body. However, the genes that are rhythmic in the liver are not the same genes that are rhythmic in the brain. And so it's very important to take into account where you're looking in the body, and of course, the time at which you're looking at it, right? And this is really interesting because if you look at the top 100 best-selling drugs identified by the World Health Organization and essential medicines, the majority of them have targets, gene targets, that are regulated by the circadian clock. And so there's this idea that if we paid more attention to these concepts, we could really use this information to better design treatment and medication. So in other words, if we have a drug, we know it acts on this target. If we deliver at a certain time of day, when we know it's maximally effective, we can improve the response to that drug as well as reduce the side effects with that drug. And so we call this term chronotherapy. And that's something that we can think about more as we think about the pandemic and COVID-19. And so at this point, I'm going to hop off and let Justin take over and talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you. So I'm going to have to get used to the prompting of moving to the next slide, because usually I do that myself, but Dr. Gamble's going to do it for me. And we're going to shift gears and apply all of this knowledge about sleep and circadian rhythms to COVID-19 and what we're experiencing now. So a couple of points on chronotherapy that Dr. Gamble just mentioned. So we know that cholesterol peaks during the nighttime hours, and these different hormones like melatonin peak at night, core body temperature decreases during the day, cortisol increases as we get ready to wake up, cholesterol peaks during the nighttime, and cholesterol reducing drugs such as statins tend to work better at night. It's interesting, one area of debate right now is whether hypertension drugs, blood pressure lowering medications might work better at night. And so interestingly, to tie the circadian piece into statin medication use is that statins reduce COVID-19 severity. And I think if we wanted to do some research on circadian rhythms in COVID-19, we would find that there is a robust circadian signal in a lot of elements of circadian 19 infection. There is some evidence that COVID-19 symptoms tend to get worse at night. And so there may be some rhythms within severity of COVID-19 symptoms themselves. Also, another key point is that sleep plays a big role in immune response. So we know anybody who's been sleep deprived chronically tends to, it negatively affects their immune system. And so in that sense, it can increase our risk for viral infections, and it can also interfere with the ability of vaccines to perform. So we typically encourage people, when you get a vaccine, make sure you're getting plenty of rest to allow your body's natural immune system to respond to that vaccine. And in rodent models, we've actually found, and of course, this is something we can't do in humans, but we found that if we eliminate the circadian clock, that impairs the rodent's ability to fight the flu. And we see this across a variety of conditions. Next slide. So in terms of the way COVID-19 then in turn might affect sleep, we know that any viral illness, and it doesn't matter what the viral illness is, it affects your ability to sleep, right? Like if you've got the flu, you don't sleep well for a bit of time. If you've got a stomach virus like rotavirus, you don't tend to sleep all that well. And COVID-19 is no different. And so then you have this issue of you need sleep to fight off the infection, but the infection itself impairs your ability to sleep. And I think that's something that is important to address and something we really need to take into account when we're treating our patients, whether it be in the hospital or outside the hospital. Another point with COVID-19 that's interesting is that UAB has this post-COVID clinic that takes care of patients who are experiencing long-term effects from COVID-19. Dr. Shruti Anahotri is in neurology and is one of the people leading this clinic. And she and I have met a couple of times to talk about sleep symptoms. And what we've discovered is that a lot of patients with COVID or post-COVID syndrome have either chronic insomnia and or hypersomnia. So hypersomnia being that they need to sleep all the time versus insomnia or even a little bit of both. And I see that in my clinic, in the behavioral sleep medicine clinic, frequently. Another thing that's interesting about viral illnesses is that it can trigger an autoimmune response, right? So when you get sick with a virus, the body mobilizes the immune system to fight off the virus, but at the same time, it can there can be collateral damage, right? And so one hypothesis about narcolepsy, and for those of you not familiar with narcolepsy, it's a sleep disorder where individuals are very sleepy during the day. They can have sleep attacks and this thing called cataplexy. But one thought is that people get a viral illness early on in their life, and the parts of the brain that is responsible for sleep-wake transitions and REM sleep that Dr. Gamble was talking about earlier are impacted by a viral illness, and that kind of then creates narcolepsy symptoms. So there's a lot of ways that COVID-19 can affect sleep. Next slide. So a legitimate question at this point is what happens to our sleep and circadian rhythms during a pandemic? And I was contacted by the UAB Public Relations Office because they wanted to do an interview because they learned that one of the most frequently Googled questions of 2020 was, why can't I fall asleep? And so once they noticed that, they said, we need to talk with some of the sleep clinicians to see what we're seeing here. So that's one of the things I'm going to try to cover with the remaining slides. Next. So if you think about COVID-19, and not just COVID-19, but particular to our experience over the past year is the elements of being in a pandemic that can affect sleep. You have the illness itself, right? So COVID-19 can cause you to have trouble sleeping, but you have all sorts of things surrounding that. You can have increased anxiety, social isolation during stay-at-home orders, increased depressive symptoms, changes in work schedule, decreased physical activity, and decreased light exposure. So these are all ways that would negatively impact your sleep. And I'm going to go through each one of these one at a time. So in terms of COVID-19, no, the next slide was good, Karen. Thanks. Anxiety about COVID-19, potentially being exposed, getting it, having family or friends, their health if they have it. Financial concerns, if you've been laid off or lose your job because of the pandemic that we're on, all of those things negatively impact sleep, right? And it does that a variety of ways. One of the things that I see most often in clinic is people start to worry a little bit more than they normally would. And that negative cognitive activity during the day and at night impacts people's sleep. And particularly, I think the mind racing that people experience. And what I hear frequently is that people lay down at bedtime and maybe they've been busy all day and it's the first time they're really alone with their thoughts and they start to think about things, life in general. And if those thoughts tend to be negative and very lead to strong emotions, that can impact one's ability to sleep, fall asleep. Or if you wake up in the middle of the night, you start thinking about it. The other way that anxiety and stress comes into play is that cortisol is a stress hormone that has a rhythm, like Dr. Gamble alluded to, and it should decrease over the course of the day. And then it rises just before we wake up, almost like in preparation for waking up and getting out of bed. And cortisol could potentially stay elevated in times of stress. And so acutely, like during a pandemic, we could see higher levels of cortisol across the day and not see as much of a rhythm as we would otherwise. Next. I wanted to talk a little bit about the unique situation that I think we're all in. Obviously, I'm sitting here in a room in my house instead of at a cafe talking to y'all about COVID-19 and sleep. And I spend a lot of time in this chair. I had sleep clinic today, so I was seeing patients all day today in this chair. And so it really changes how you live your life, right? Normally, if I was on campus, I'd be walking around a lot, getting a lot more sunlight. And so some of the lifestyle changes that we see are less activity levels, spending more time by yourself. We have seen with work, longer hours potentially. If you don't have a commute, you know, that can be good or bad, but you may be spending more time actually working, and it's harder to separate work and life. You know, at what point do you leave the room that you're in working and then you know, join your family or, you know, engage in your non-work life? And another interesting thought that I just find fascinating is the salience of this impact of leaving work, right? So like if I'm in my office at the Sparks building, there is this moment when I get to leave my office and walk to my car in the parking deck and leave. And that's like a formal part of my day, right? I don't have that anymore. There is no leaving to go to work or coming home, for better or for worse. So a lot of this schedule that we see goes away in our day, and schedules are very important to our sleep wake. You see this nice picture of what I assume many of us are dealing with right now, where you're trying to juggle work and life.
I just gave a real life example a few minutes earlier.
I was thinking that. I didn't want to call you out on that, Dr. Gamble, but I was just thinking that same point.
I was waiting for you to make the joke.
So, and I think separate from the lifestyle changes that we experience is light exposure. If you're spending more time inside because you get some of your light exposure by walking from meeting to meeting or commuting in or commuting out, you may actually be exposed to less light during the day if you're spending more time in a room. And as Dr. Gamble pointed out earlier, light is critical for entraining your circadian system, to let your circadian system know that it's time to be awake, it's time to go to bed. And if we're spending more time in darker rooms instead of being outside or in front of a computer screen, that can disrupt our circadian rhythm and our sleep-wake system. And then lastly, one of the things that I see a lot is a lot of people do have, I mean, this was thrust upon us. So your workroom may be a bedroom. And so in clinic, I tell patients all the time, the bed should be for sleep or sex alone, no non-sleep sex activities in the bed and bedroom. And that's a behavioral and cognitive piece to treating insomnia. But during a pandemic, you may be working in your bedroom. And so then you don't have that clear separation anymore. And that can negatively impact your sleep. Next. There's also this idea of revenge bedtime procrastination. I don't know how many of you have heard this. I saw it first, I think, on CNN and a couple of other news outlets. And it's this idea that, and I think it's gotten worse during the pandemic, but if our lives are busy during the day where we're trying to work, we've got kids, like I have kids that are doing virtual school, um, trying to carve out me time, self-care time is very difficult. And so that starts to infringe upon your bedtime. And so this picture is kind of what I imagine with a lot of people, where you finally get 5 to 10 minutes of quiet by yourself, but the only time you have that is like when it's time to go to bed. And so hence the term revenge bedtime procrastination, where you're actually, sacrificing some sleep to be able to spend some time for yourself. And that's an increasing phenomenon that we see. Next. But I don't want to make this sound like everything is bad, because I have interestingly found some upsides to the current changes to life. So flexible work hours is a great example. We've gotten away from a traditional 9 to 5 work schedule for some people, and people are working at home more on their terms. And what I've noticed is that for people who are more night owls that would prefer to go to bed later and sleep in later, this gets at Dr. Gamble's point about everybody's circadian system and timing is different. So some people are morning people, some people are night owls. The night owls during the pandemic have actually had their sleep drift more in line with their circadian system and started going to bed later and sleeping a little bit later. And I think that may actually be a good thing. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time. I think, the lack of a commute does allow for a bit more time in your day. The downside is that some people use that time to work, but I have colleagues, one in New York that I'm thinking about, that said, I just started exercising. I don't have to commute anymore. So I started exercising in the morning. So there are opportunities for that lack of a commute to really allow you to do more things outside of work. I personally have noticed that my eating behaviors have actually improved. So I will eat healthier and eat more regular meals at home than I necessarily would if I'm at UAB. So that may be a change that you notice for the better. More time with family. That could be debatable. I think some of you may say, right about now, I could probably use a little bit less time with family. Dr. Gamble may have been thinking that just about 10, 15 minutes ago. But it does allow for more time with family. And I'll say on a personal note, I've got a 7-month-old, and for several of my kids, I did not get to spend this much time with them growing up. And for the 7-month-old, I've seen more development in 7 months that I was ever able to see before. And my wife has had somewhat of a natural year-long maternity leave now instituted by staying, working from home. So pros and cons. I think that the psychologist in me is taking the cognitive therapy perspective of taking the situation and looking at different ways to view it. And so I think there's some truth in that. And then lastly, virtual school has really, at least in our case, reduced early school start times. In kids, one of the concerns is that during puberty, the circadian system moves later so that bedtimes and wake up times are a little bit later, yet school start times are early. And this is really a hot topic in the sleep community right now. And so I think what this has allowed is that I've seen some adolescents who start school a little bit later, and my kids do that, and it's really helped. So there are some pros that have come out of this. Next. So I think this is the last slide. Dr. Gamble and I wanted to have lots of time for questions and answers, because I know a lot of people have questions about COVID and a lot of questions about sleep. So maybe we can kill a couple of birds with one stone. But the last slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we can do. So I think based on all of the the neuroscience that Dr. Gamble provided and some of the impacts of COVID on sleep and vice versa, planning some physical activity into your day and maintaining a schedule can be very helpful in buffering from some of the effects of working from home. Increasing your light exposure during the day. It's interesting. If you increase your light exposure during the day, it actually protects a little bit against some of the effects of light in the evening. Not that I would start to encourage people to expose themselves to a lot of light in the evening, but daily light does matter. And so I think being able to increase our light exposure helps. I sit on my back. I've got a screen porch. And so I sit on the back porch for meetings sometimes just to make sure I'm getting plenty of sunlight and not staying inside too much. Within my behavioral sleep medicine clinic, I talk with patients a lot about limiting news and social media exposure, particularly in the evening. I think that's really something that contributes a lot to people's mind racing when they start getting concerned about life events. And so I think that's something that can certainly be helpful. Hard to do, but helpful. And then we teach relaxation and mindfulness techniques and exercises. And I think that's something that also can be very beneficial. And these are all things that you can do on your own to really maximize or optimize your ability to sleep in very stressful times. And then lastly, I would suggest people, whether it be for mental health reasons or sleep reasons, to seek help when needed. Be aware when things are tough and reach out for help. I think I can't state that enough. And I think that's something we do at UAB, a really good job of emphasizing self-care even amongst the providers. And I'm certainly welcome to try to answer questions outside of the talk if anybody feels that would be warranted. But at this point, we will end our discussion of that and open the floor for question and answer. I don't know, Susan, how you or Dr. Lottie, how y'all prefer.
I just wanted to really quickly point out, just regarding Justin's last point, this is the phone number for the UAB Sleep-Wake Disorders Center. And there's also some great information here on the National Sleep Foundation. And also, I just want to point out, we've got a lot of really great partners at UAB outside the Comprehensive Neuroscience Center. So there's a lot of, for example, the Vision Science Research Center, the Nutrition Obesity Research Center. So there's a lot of really great research happening at UAB. And so we've got some good partners. But yeah, so do you want me to stop screen sharing for the question and answer session?
I think that would be great.
Hey, Karen, I have a question.
Really? Okay.
So you mentioned that with adolescents, they seem to be more night owls, but you said that's genetically determined. So why do you think it is that adolescents tend to shift to a night owl as opposed if it's something that's more genetically determined?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Even if you're sort of born as a, early bird type, as you hit adolescence, you're still going to become later. So my son, who you guys got to meet earlier, is actually more of an early bird. My other son is more of a night owl. And even though my early bird son is an early bird, he's definitely gotten later in adolescence. And we don't know what causes them to get later, actually. Justin, I think you would agree with that. But it does seem to be pretty universal in humans, not universal, but a pretty common. Young adults, so that includes college students as well. They also tend to be later. And then you'll probably, when you think about, in the older communities, as you retire and even the decades past that, the older you get, the earlier people tend to go to bed and wake up in the morning. And that's something that has just been shown over and over and over again. And we really don't know the mechanisms behind why that happens.
And this is across cultures? This is across cultures?
It is, yeah. So actually, Till Rinneberg, who's in Germany, has actually, now he has surveyed as well as done biomarker studies in millions of people at this point across cultures, different latitudes. And it does tend to be pretty universal. Yeah, it's a great question though.
Yeah, and I was fortunate enough as an undergrad to do some work with Dr. Mary Carskadden Brown on some of the early pioneering work, and the research that she did. She actually took adolescents and she would put them in the basement of a house, and it was like four adolescents in any given summer, but they would spend all summer. And we measured the circadian rhythms over the summer in completely dark conditions in the basement. Well, not completely dark, because she did what's called a forced asynchrony protocol, which I'm not going to get into, but basically it allowed us to separate their sleep from their circadian rhythm. And we observed some of those differences and found that students' circadian rhythms changed as they moved through puberty. So that seems to be kind of that marker where some of the hormone fluctuations that occur also, like there's a circadian impact there. And I also think, prior to that point, the reason that her research was so groundbreaking is because people just assumed that it was a behavioral thing, right? That adolescents stay up late because they want to. And so that was the first time somebody said, no, there's really a biological basis for that. But I would also argue that there's probably some behavioral elements that can make it worse, right? So like if somebody has a predisposition to having a little bit later circadian rhythm once they hit adolescence, if they're up in front of screens at night doing schoolwork, then that some people are more sensitive to light, and that could push them even further later. So I think there's an interaction there as well.
Mike Sloan, Ginger.
Yeah, so alcohol is a major disruptor of sleep architecture. So do you think the increased alcohol consumption that seems to be happening during COVID is a bigger contributor to the disruptions than, say, anxiety? Not that they're separable, but
right. Yeah, no, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but there are some interesting data coming out about people drinking alcohol more during the pandemic, and we know that increases your risk for sleep apnea or makes sleep apnea worse. It fragments your sleep, so I think that could potentially be a big factor in people's sleep and circadian rhythms. And that,
Yeah, I think there's also,
I didn't have a bullet for that.
there's also a misconception too. I think sometimes people think that alcohol might improve their sleep because it does, it does make you sleepy, right? But the issue is that that's a very short-lived effect. So when you think about your entire sleep session at night being 7 to 8 hours, the problem is that wears off in a few hours. And that's when that sleep fragmentation that Dr. Thomas just referred to will set in. And then also it increases urination. So you also have to get up and go to the bathroom. So it's a real problem, I think. So I think in general, Dr. Thomas, I don't know if you want to sort of give the general guidelines for eating and drinking close to bedtime. That might be a good time for that comment.
Yeah, well, and I'll throw caffeine in there too. Typically the recommendation for caffeine is not afternoon. The half-life of caffeine is 6 to 8 hours. And so, but people metabolize it differently. So you have to be aware of your sensitivity to caffeine. In terms of alcohol, usually, at least 2 or 3 hours before intended bedtime is a good time to kind of wind that down, which is, tough for some people if they're drinking a glass of wine or something with dinner or having a nightcap. So, but it's something that in sleep clinic, we tend to use sleep diaries to investigate and try to tease out how much of the alcohol is playing a role. Because we can look across like a couple of weeks with the sleep diary data to get to your point, Dr. Sloan, about like the potential of alcohol having an impact versus other things like anxiety. That the sleep diaries help us a lot with that.
Yeah. Ginger wanted to ask a question.
Mhm.
You have to unmute.
I've always thought, and I do try in the afternoons late to do some exercise to help sleep. How long before you're going to go to bed should you go ahead and do, say, 30 minutes of vigorous exercise?
Mhm.
Is it closer to time or farther?
We asked Burl since he's exercising right now.
I saw somebody on a machine somewhere.
Yeah, well, I think one answer we'll always give is that it depends on the person. Some people seem to be more susceptible to light, caffeine, and exercise is kind of the same way. I've known people that say that they exercise before bedtime and can sleep. But I think if you start to notice that physical activity does seem to rev you up a little bit and make it harder to fall asleep, then that may be where you would want to reduce it. And similar to alcohol, typically we'll say a couple of hours before bedtime is a good time to start making really that last hour a wind down period and trying to get your body like reducing your light exposure, reducing your activity levels, and really trying to prepare yourself for going to sleep. And the light piece of it, and exercise could be tied to that unless you're doing exercise in the dark. The light piece of it, a couple of hours before bedtime is really important because again, the light is suppressing the melatonin levels and doesn't allow your brain to start producing the melatonin.
So a couple of hours would be good.
Mhm.
Thanks.
So there's a question in the chat from Adela Harvey. With decreased activity during the pandemic, do we need less sleep? So this is really interesting, and I think we get this question about sleep need a lot, even independent of the pandemic, because as we age and get older, we tend to sleep less. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that just because we sleep less as we age means that we need less sleep. And I would say the same is true for the pandemic, that just because we may be sleeping less doesn't mean we need less sleep. Regarding the activity and exercise, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation about all of the different purposes or reasons for why we sleep, some of those are memory consolidation, for example. That hasn't, obviously exercise is great for memory enhancement, but there are lots of mental processes that are energy consuming that have that aren't directly related to your physical activity. And so I think you still need just as much sleep, whether you're physically active less or not. I don't know, Dr. Thomas, you want to add on to any of that, but
actually, yeah, I think one of the things that I notice is that people are different in terms of how much activity they need to be able to sleep well. And so I've noticed that we'll have some patients come into clinic that will notice that they decrease their physical activity and it makes it harder for them to sleep. And they need a certain amount of physical activity during the day to be able to sleep well. And so in that sense, I echo Dr. Gamble's point. I don't think it changes your sleep need at all, but decreased physical activity might actually make it more difficult to sleep and sleep through the night. We also know that increased physical activity can actually one of the few things that can deepen your sleep. So when Dr. Gamble is talking about that in 3 deep stages of sleep, increased physical activity levels can actually deepen your sleep and make it so that you achieve more of the N3 sleep.
Justin, do you want to go ahead and tag on to that about how much sleep is considered healthy for someone in their mid-40s?
Yeah, well, and there's one about adolescence too. So I'll just talk about the lifespan. So in general, infants and babies need a fair amount of sleep. It can be 12 to 14 hours. Plus or minus a few hours. And then as we get into kind of past puberty and adolescence, it's around 9, maybe even as many as 10 hours. So right now, the concern is that a lot of high school students and college students are probably chronically sleep deprived because they're not getting 9 to 10 hours. And then as we get into adulthood between say, 25 in up to about 65 or 70, 7 to 8 hours is considered average. Now, I want to emphasize, because I had this discussion with a patient today in clinic, that that's an average, right? And Dr. Gamble pointed out that sleep need is driven by genetics. Thank you, because this is the perfect slide to show for this. This is from the National Sleep Foundation, and it highlights what I was just emphasizing about sleep need from basically birth into older adulthood. And it illustrates that your sleep need doesn't change dramatically after about 18 years of age. Your ability to sleep consolidated at night may change, but the sleep need doesn't change dramatically. So hopefully that helps people with a sense of how much sleep you may need in adolescence versus into adulthood. The other thing that Dr. Gamble pointed out in the sleep hypnogram is that the depth of sleep changes across the age, so that you tend to get more N3 and deeper stages of sleep in adolescence than you do, unfortunately, as you get a little bit older. And so awakenings and fragmented sleep become more of the norm as we get older.
I believe there was a question about light therapy devices. Sorry, let me pull my chat back up. What light therapy devices do you recommend? So I definitely don't want to specifically recommend a brand necessarily. To be honest, okay, my first response is you should be exposed to natural light as much as possible. Because of where we live here in the Southeast, and I understand not everybody on this call is necessarily from the Southeast, but you know, we don't have as much of a shortened light cycle in the winter as you have in the more northern regions, where things like seasonal affective disorder is definitely more prevalent, although we do have people that suffer from seasonal affective disorder in the South as well. So I think that is probably when the time when light therapy devices are really going to come into play, is really in those winter times when you naturally are going to have shorter natural light exposure. But the reality is that even on a dark, overcast day like kind of today was in Birmingham, you're going to get way more intensity of light than you would even in your brightest room in your house. So obviously natural light is going to be your best light, but if you can't have that and you want a light therapy device, I mean, you want to be sure, obviously, that you're not looking directly into it because you don't want to damage your retinas. So you want it to be sort of off to the side. There are a lot of devices that will say blue light is better, and that's because there's a specialized subset of ganglion cells in your retina that have photoreceptive capabilities like your rods and your cones, and they're very selectively respond to blue light. And so that's why they say blue light is particularly important for resetting your circadian clocks and improving sleep-wake cycles. However, even white light has lots of blue wavelength in it. So white light is just as good, in my opinion, as blue light. So the main thing is that you get exposure to light in the early morning, in your daytime hours, and that you avoid that blue light. Once it starts to get dark outside, that's when you really want to start, using your softer lamps in the house, things like that. Don't do what Burl's doing. He's got this bright light behind his head. It's getting evening. He should probably have his blue light blocking glasses on while he's exercising. What time do you go to bed, Burl?
Well, so if I may, real quick, daylight savings time seems like a sick joke. I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, but since daylight saving went into effect, now all of a sudden I can't wake up when I normally do. And when I'm trying to wind down, I get on the treadmill. This has been the last 4 days, but like, what's up with that? And do we really need daylight saving time anymore?
Yeah, so I'm glad you raised that. I was waiting for that question to come up. We're probably both prepared for this one, but I think it's horrible that we shift our clocks twice a year. I mean, it's just, and there's actually been a lot of research about it, that the week, especially in the spring where we spring forward, that week there are more cardiovascular incidents and heart attack. There's also more wreck traffic accidents and wrecks on the interstate that week as well. And so it's definitely, in my opinion, not a good thing. And there's a huge push to get rid of it. So you want to add to that, Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, no, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine basically formally for the first time came out with a position statement suggesting that we get rid of time changes. I think where you live in the time zone also matters, right? Because having grown up on the west coast of Florida and now living in Birmingham, you're not that far apart, yet you're in two different time zones. And so where you're at in the time zone tends to matter. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting information around that. And it'll be interesting to see where we're at 5, 10, 15 years down the road in terms of time change.
There's a question about melatonin.
Yeah. So
Caroline and Daniel have been raising their hand for a while. So
oh, I'm sorry.
you unmute.
Thank you.
Can you unmute? We cannot hear
There we
you.
go.
Hey there. Okay, this is my husband, Robert.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear
Okay,
you.
This is my question, Dr. Gamble. You were explaining that as we age, our sleep patterns tend to change and that our deeper sleep patterns tend to change. I've noticed, I'm 72, and I've noticed in the past couple of years, I dream every night, and I don't have bad dreams. I have working dreams. I've had 4 careers, and I pull all the people together and solve problems all night long, and I'm worn out in the morning. Is there a reason I'm doing that? Is there something that can be done about that?
So am I muted? Hang on a minute.
No, you're not.
Guys
We
hear
can
me?
hear you.
Okay, good. So I'm gonna answer it, but I definitely want Dr. Thomas to answer this question as well, because I'm a researcher and not a clinician. So that's my first disclaimer. And I definitely think having a clinician viewpoint on this as well is important. So I lost my Zoom controls here. There we go. So one thing about dreaming, so this is always kind of complicated because the reality is that when we sleep, we sort of have amnesia. And I was going to try to show it again, but I can't pull it up quickly. But as you cycle through those sleep stages, which we refer to as sleep architecture, I think somebody used that word earlier. If you are progressing through your stages properly, you should actually come out of REM sleep and progress back through the other sleep stages before you wake up. And so in some ways so a lot of times when I hear people say that they are having very vivid dreams, it's possible that there is a sleep architecture issue in terms of how they're progressing through those sleep stages. So that was one of the things that I showed you in the slide that you noticed, is that it wasn't just the amount of time in each of the stages, but the order in which you progress through those stages seemed to be disordered. And this is where I'm going to stop talking and let Dr. Thomas speak as a clinician, because that's all I have to say about that.
Well, and I think one of the earlier slides pointed out that we tend to have 4 to 5 REM periods during the night, which is when we dream. And so most of the time, kind of you're blissfully ignorant to the fact that you're unaware, I guess would be a better way to put it, that you're going through REM periods. And if you don't wake up in the middle of the REM period, you may not remember the dream. And so I think what may be more likely happening as we age is that your sleep naturally gets lighter and it gets easier to wake up, and you're going to wake up more frequently as you get older. And so it's more likely that you may wake up in the middle of a dream period and actually be awake long enough to like process that you were dreaming and remember it. And so that's something that I really like to explain. And I think clinically, if somebody is waking up and feeling fatigued and worn out, then we would want to do potentially like have them seen and like potentially want to do an overnight sleep study just to see if there's anything else that may be contributing to that sense of tiredness and fatigue during the day. Because dreaming in and of itself doesn't frequently produce feelings of fatigue. But waking up frequently and being aware of the dreaming could, and there could be an underlying sleep disorder that we would want to check out. For example, sleep apnea is more common in REM sleep. And so we would just want to make sure that that's not what's contributing to the awakenings.
I think we have a question from Mr. Miller. Can you unmute yourself?
If you hit your space bar, I think it might unmute.
Were you referring to me?
Well, yeah, but I know Susie also has a question.
Oh, okay.
Edward had his hand raised for a very long time, so you're still muted, Ed.
Susan, you might be able to unmute him.
Now,
There we go.
I'm unmuted now.
But Susie, you're next.
Speaking of the REM, is it my turn for a question?
Yes, it is.
Speaking for the REM situation, how about the situation when REM occurs and the individual goes into a very active state? I know I have that problem, and I play football sometimes, I play basketball, I fight, I run for my life from wild animals, and my poor wife gets beat up and things like that, you know. So what is going on there?
Yeah, so normally during REM sleep, our brain tells our bodies to be paralyzed so we don't act out our dreams. But
Right.
if that doesn't happen, then that could be an indication of REM behavior disorder where you act out your dreams. And that's the type of sleep disorder that should be evaluated. So
Right.
for anybody that acts out their dreams, I typically encourage them to talk with their primary care physician or get a referral to a sleep clinic to
Okay.
get that evaluated.
All right. And that would be, the situation would be examined during a sleep study, right?
Yes, sir. And that's something that we could pick up on the sleep study. And there's a couple of different treatment options that really can help with that.
Okay. Who would I contact about that? I'm a UAB veteran. I taught biochemistry there for 40 years and to medical, dental, and graduate students. And so I know my way around there, but I never really ran into anyone that would be on top of this situation. Who would I contact?
Yes. So there's a phone number there for the UAB Sleep-Wake Disorders Center. So some people will have their primary care doctor refer them if their insurance requires that. But otherwise, you could contact the sleep center directly, and they would get you taken care of.
Also, if you go to the VA, there's also a sleep clinic associated with the VA as well. I think you mentioned that you were a veteran. So we have very good. Go ahead.
No, I'm not a veteran. I'm veteran of the UAB biochemistry.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
That number was is that the 205-930-7114 number? 7114?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh yeah, I see it up there now. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So how about I go back to Susie's question about the melatonin, and then there's a couple more in the chat, Dr. Thomas, if you want to
Can you stop
take
sharing,
those.
Karen? Can you stop sharing?
Yes, sorry. Thank you. Okay, so Susie was asking about if you can tell what your natural levels of melatonin. So as far as I know, there's no over-the-counter test for that. I mean, obviously that's something that we do in the lab in my studies and Dr. Thomas studies as well. I don't know if Dr. Gooden is also measuring melatonin in his studies, but a number of us at UAB in our sleep and circadian studies are measuring melatonin. You can measure melatonin in the saliva or in the blood. There's, I think outside of doing those tests, it's really hard to know. You could enroll in a study and find that out. That would be one way to know.
Yeah.
But I would say that one, I guess, way that, so that the specific cells in the retina that are particularly important for this light suppression of melatonin, that would tell you that that system is intact, are also the same cells that control your pupillary light restriction. So if there's a problem, at least with the cells that are in your retina, for example, which is part of that pathway, you would also have potentially an issue with like your pupils restricting when you go outside and there's really bright light, for example. But other than that, I don't think there's no sort of over-the-counter way to do that.
Thank you. I was just curious.
Yeah, we're unfortunately probably still a few years away from being able to have chronobiology medical clinics. But that's something that's a goal of mine in the future, because I think that would certainly be helpful in diagnosing circadian rhythm disorders, for example, is knowing what people's melatonin levels are and what's normal and what's not. But I think there's going to be a lot more work.
Is that one of the things that also declines once we get into our 50s, since everything else starts declining? Is it safe to assume that that would be affected as well?
There have been some reports of the pineal gland, which is what produces melatonin. There have been some reports of calcification of the pineal gland as we age, but I'm not sure how prevalent that is. I still think that it's still a pretty rare event with aging, but there have been reports of it.
Yeah.
Hi, so while we're on melatonin, can I ask a quick question? Couple of years ago, I stopped drinking when I realized I have an issue with it. So when I did stop drinking, I couldn't sleep for a month. So I took some melatonin supplements, and that helped me pace. I used it for a week or 5 days, and then it would help me get into the rhythm. And then I would stop, and sometimes if it would fall apart again, I would do it again. So I've had a regular sleep until the pandemic, and now I'm suffering again. So I'm now scared to take supplements. What's your opinion or recommendation about supplements, melatonin supplements?
I think one thing I like to emphasize to everybody is because it's over the counter and not FDA regulated, there's a lot of variability from brand to brand to brand. And so I am reluctant to recommend it simply from the standpoint that you don't necessarily know what you're getting. And in fact, there was a paper published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine a few years ago where they looked at like 30-something supplements and found that there was wide variation in the actual melatonin content, ranging from about 83% less than the dose on the box to 278% more than the dose on the box. So I like people to at least go into things knowing what to expect since it's over the counter supplement. The other thing is that there's a UCP label or UPC label, basically United States Pharmacopoeia, that does test some over the counter supplements. And they're really the only agency I'm aware of that does that. And so you would at least want to look for that label if you decided you wanted to try melatonin. You know, we've talked about speaking with your primary care doctor or a sleep clinic if you need help. And that was in one of the questions that hopefully I just addressed. I would ask your physicians what their thoughts are on melatonin, because there could be interactions with other things that you're taking. People assume that melatonin is safe because it's natural, but the melatonin that you get over the counter is way more than your brain produces. So I think just some basic background information like that can help people make an informed decision about what they want to try it. It's best used.
I would also say that it depends on what your purpose in taking melatonin. Melatonin has two different effects. One is called a soporific effect that helps you go to sleep, but there's a different effect that also will cause your circadian rhythms to shift earlier. So if you're Dr. Gooden and you are trying to adjust to daylight savings time and you want to shift earlier, you should take melatonin in the late afternoon to early evening. And on the back of the box, or even your primary care physician, generally they tell you to take melatonin right before you go to bed. But if your bedtime is 1 a.m. and you take it at midnight, that's probably not going to do a whole lot of advancing of your clock. Now, that's all, again, assuming, like Dr. Thomas suggested, that you've got a good melatonin supplement that's pure. And I completely agree. You don't need anywhere near the dose that they tell you to take on the back of the bottle either. Usually much less is plenty.
Actually, to put it into perspective, most clinical trials on melatonin have been done at 0.3 milligrams. And what they sell over the counter is typically anywhere from 3 to 5 to 10 milligrams. So there's a big difference there, obviously.
Thank you.
Our European colleagues think that we are crazy for not FDA regulating melatonin.
Indeed.
I think Mike Stone has a question.
I was just wondering if there was any increased appreciation for all the work on from chronobiologists on shift work demanded by medical school residents and 16 hours and 24-hour shifts, which produce all these medical accidents and things like that, and makes no sense from circadian rhythms or chronobiology, and yet the insistence is still there. Has there been any progress in acknowledging the work of chronobiologists?
Actually, Chuck Seisler at Harvard has actually done a lot of work on that and has published a lot of papers on residents. And he was actually responsible a few years ago for, I guess maybe it's been more than a few at this point, for getting some new policies passed, limiting the number of hours of residence. And I don't know, maybe, maybe the medical education people were irritated now that we had to limit the number of hours, but I think it was is a good idea. And I'm not sure that was quite enough. I don't know, Dr. Thomas, if you want to comment on that further.
Yeah, he was the first. I was thinking the same thing. He's the first person I thought of when you brought that up. He had this really cool study where he hooked residents up to EEG, and found that during walking rounds in the morning, their eyes were open, but their EEG signal was slow and represented them being asleep. And so he used that study as the impetus to really try to start making some changes. So there has been progress. Are we there yet? I don't know. And it's tough. There's no easy solution to shift work. And, you know, when you talk to residents who are having to do night float, when my wife was a resident, they didn't have night float. I mean, they just did really long, ridiculous kind of Q2, Q3 call. Now they have night float, and that was supposed to help. But even then, you'll hear people say that they struggle with flipping back and forth between days and nights. So it's tough.
Which is what the hospital nurses do.
Right.
So even if they're on permanent night shift and they work from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., on their days off, they're going to go back to sleeping at night. So it's basically like flying from San Francisco to Tokyo every 3 days. But yeah.
This is analogous to like long haul truck drivers and stuff too, right? Hasn't there been studies showing that like there's a certain amount of sleep deprivation whereby when you test those individuals, they perform comparable to people who are like 0.08 inebriated?
That's
so, like,
right. Yeah, actually, I was part of a working group that actually made another policy. And there are some states that have actually passed legislation that drowsy driving is just as dangerous as driving under the influence of alcohol. And I can't remember the number of states. There's like at least 5 or 6 states now that have passed drowsy driving legislation. So I can dig up the working group publication, the white paper that we published, and send that over to Susan if someone's interested. But it provides guidelines on sort of the minimum hours of sleep that you should have if you're going to operate a vehicle.
Dr. Leiter, we have one more question in the chat. Do we have time for answering that one question?
Yeah.
Okay. The question is emotional distress from dreaming a legitimate thing, and does it have anything to do with disrupted sleep architecture? I would say that emotional distress from a dream is a legitimate thing. And we see it like in the VA setting. Individuals who have experienced any kind of traumatic event can have trauma-driven dreams and nightmares that are emotionally distressing. And part of our treatment is to there's behavioral and medication ways to treat nightmares, but we really work hard to try to decrease people's distress level. And I think that goes across the board. People with insomnia can get very distressed in the middle of the night about being awake in the middle of the night. And we work very hard, not just treating their sleep, but treating the distress part of it too, because that doesn't really help a lot with the sleep problem itself. So it's definitely a very legitimate thing. And I'll circle back to my suggestion to, you know, if it's for anybody in the audience that's concerned about distress from their sleep, please reach out and we'd be happy to try to help with that. In terms of it being involved with disrupted sleep architecture, I think like our point earlier, if you wake up in the middle of a dream, you're more likely to remember it. And then if you're more likely to remember it, you're more likely to be distressed by it potentially. So I think sleep fragmentation could potentially impact that. So it does have a little bit to do with that. Hopefully that answers your question.
Very good. Well, is there any more questions for tonight? Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Gamble and Dr. Thomas for really a fantastic presentation and being so practical. And thank you for all of you to come tonight. And I hope we will see you again in our future Neuroscience Cafe. So remember, next month should really be very interesting about COVID and the impact of COVID. So all of you have a good evening and thank you again. Bye.